Hello, I'm Ollie and this is Criminolly, where I talk about crime, pulp, horror, that kind of thing. Today, horror, I'm talking about the 10 books that have won the best horror novel in the Goodreads Choice Awards over the last 10 years. So I was approached 2 or 3 months ago to take part in this project. So it's not just me doing it. There are a huge range of different booktubers who are all covering different genres and talking about the books that in those genres that won the Goodreads Choice Awards, as I say, over the last 10 years. So when I was approached, I thought, wow, this is a really interesting idea. Goodreads is such a kind of central part to so many of our reading lives. I thought to, kind of examine the books that have won the Goodreads Choice Awards was a fantastic idea, and I was very pleased to be part of the project. That that feeling of pleasure quickly faded when I looked at the list of books that I needed to read, and I think that the experience has been similar for many of the other people who are taking part as well. So I should say there will be a link in the description to the video to a playlist with all of the different people's videos in, so you can look at all the different genres and types of books. But it felt in the chats we were having about this project like a fairly common theme that people were not particularly enjoying the books that they were reading. And I think there's a reason for that, and I think this is really why this whole project was started in the first place. Well, if you like, that the hypothesis for it is that the Goodreads Choice Awards is a popularity contest rather than a literary award with any real value. And the reason for that is, if you think about it, the way the Goodreads Choice Awards work is Goodreads picks a load of books, and I think there is a way you can nominate them, but they have to have a certain number of ratings and things like that on Goodreads to be nominatable. And then they shortlist those, and they give you a list of like 10 books or whatever it is, and say, here are the 10. Here are the nominees for the best horror novel of 2022. Vote on the one you think is best. Now the problem with that is very few people will have read all of the books. And what you will get is people will vote on the book they have read. So if they've only read one horror novel in the year, that's the one that will get their vote. So the more popular a book is, the more likely it is to win the award. And that may have nothing to do with the quality of the book at all. And indeed, when I talk you through the list of books that won over the last 10 years, I think you can see that theory played out. So yeah, it was definitely an interesting thing to get involved with, and I'm glad that I did it. But boy, did I read some not terribly good books as part of it. So in terms of this video, I'll tell you in a moment what the 10 books were, and then I will do brief reviews of each of them, and then kind of do a wrap up at the end. And in that wrap up, I kind of want to compare the list of Goodreads winners to the list of Stoker Award winners for the same years. So the Stoker Awards, if you don't know, is I think it's the Horror Writers of America annual awards for horror fiction, and those are voted on by a panel of experts who read all of the books, rather than the more populist approach that the Goodreads Choice Awards takes. So let me talk you through the 10 books. And what I would say is I was fortunate in that going into this, I had read about half of the books on the list already. So those ones I did not reread. There were a couple of books where the approach I took was slightly different than just reading the book that's listed here. So I'll talk about those as they come up. So the 2013 winner then was Dr. Sleep by Stephen King. So that was one I hadn't read. Big fan of The Shining, so I was quite looking forward to reading that. It was a book I'd intended to read anyway. 2014 winner was Prince Lestat by Anne Rice. Now I can't remember what number this is in her Vampire Chronicles series, but it's like quite a high number. It's like number 10 or something like that. There was no way I was and having done a bit of research, you can't read these books as standalone books. You need to read them in order. So there was no way I was going to read 10 books in order to give my opinion on this one. not least because I have read the first book in the series, Interview with a Vampire, which I read ages ago, which is a book that everybody loved. It was like one of those breakout horror books at the time that everyone was going on about. I didn't really like it very much, so I definitely wasn't going to inflict the pain on myself of reading the rest of the books. So for that year, I read instead the runner-up, which was Girl with All the Gifts by M.R. Carey. 2015, similarly a book from a series. So this book was St. Todd, which is the final book in the Odd Thomas series by Dean Koontz. So those ones, I did actually have all of the Odd Thomas books on my Kindle. There are 7 of them. I had read the first one before, which I thought was pretty okay. So I thought, well, they're not very long. They're like 350 pages each. I'll just read all of them. So I did read all 7 of the Odd Thomas books in order to be able to give you my opinion on St. Todd. So I may have cheated a bit with the Anne Rice book, but I feel like I went all in on the Dean Koontz. 2016, the winner was The Fireman by Joe Hill, which again I have read. 2017, the winner was Sleeping Beauty by Stephen and Owen King, which again I have read. 2018 was Elevation by Stephen King, which I had just read. I think I literally only just read it when I got asked to be part of this, and had filmed a review for it, but I've never bothered putting that review up because I'm going to talk about it now. 2019 was The Institute, also by Stephen King. 2020 was Mexican Gothic by Silvia Moreno-Garcia, which I had read. The Institute, I should say, I hadn't read. 2021 was The Final Girl Support Group by Grady Hendrix, which I had read. And 2022 was Hidden Pictures by Jason Rekulak, which I hadn't read. So you can definitely see a theme here, and that theme is Stephen King. So there are 3 books written by Stephen King on his own, a further one written by Stephen King and one of his sons, Owen, and then a 5th one written by Joe Hill, who's another of Stephen King's sons. So Stephen King and the King dynasty are absolutely dominating this list. Anne Rice, also another, very well established, really big name in horror, as is Dean Koontz. So both of those are, authors who have been able to build up their popularity and their fan base over years and years and years. And you see that with Prince of Lestat and St. Todd, both books that are, quite far on in the series, clearly very popular with the fans and winning the awards for their respective years. So that left me with 11 books I needed to read for this project, those being Dr. Sleep, the 7 books in the Odd Thomas series, The Institute, and Hidden Pictures. So I have read those over the last few weeks, have looked up my kind of Goodreads reviews and things like that for the older books that I'd already read, and I'm now prepared to give you my opinion on all of them. So first up then, the 2013 winner was Dr. Sleep by Stephen King, his sequel to The Shining, which is a book I've been looking forward to reading, but also was a bit nervous about reading. And the reason I was nervous about reading it is because I really love The Shining. The Shining is my favourite Stephen King book, and I was worried about what King was going to do in this one and whether that would tarnish my memory of The Shining. And I was right to be worried because I don't think this is a terribly good book. One of my commenters made a comment on a video a while ago. I think it was on a video where I talked about The Institute, the other King book I read for this, where they said that what King often does is, and is said openly that he does, he takes 2 different stories and blends them together to make a book. And that definitely felt like the case with Dr. Sleep. So it follows the character of Danny Torrance. So Danny is the young kid in The Shining who has like psychic powers, and in The Shining, as you will no doubt know, his father, who's an alcoholic, gets a job in this remote hotel. The mother, father and Danny go to the hotel. The father goes gradually insane, and they have to defend themselves against him basically. What happens in Dr. Sleep is Danny, as an adult, is trying to come to terms with all the stuff that happened to him, basically. And like his father in The Shining, he is, suffering with terrible addiction problems. He's an alcoholic. He's abusing drugs and things like that. And there's quite an interesting story in the book, around that. King King is someone who's written a lot about addiction, who has had, his own struggles with addiction, and it is something I think he writes quite interestingly about. And that was certainly some of the strongest parts of the book, were the parts that dealt with Danny's struggle with addiction. I thought, at least. The second half of the book then is a half of the book that if you imagine Netflix got a random bunch of writers and put them together in a room and said, come up with a sequel to The Shining, I think they would have come up with this plot or something like it. So the idea is, if you remember, in The Shining, you've got Danny Torrance, who's got psychic abilities, and then there's a cook at the hotel called Mike, who's also got psychic abilities. And logically, if there are two people who've got psychic abilities, there must be more. Yeah, and basically the other plot line in this book explores that. So it takes this concept of The Shining as an ability that people have, and says, well, what if there were a bunch of other people that have got it, and what if some of those people were bad and were using their power for evil? So what you get in this book is this gang of people who've got this ability and are really terrible people who are going around causing harm, and then also a young girl who's similar in some ways to Danny's character in The Shining, who Danny kind of forms a relationship with in a kind of mentoring capacity, almost in the same way that Mike the chef did in The Shining with him. So you've got these two stories mashed together: Danny's struggle with his alcoholism and these bad people using their abilities, and together King tries to make a book out of it, and it just didn't really feel like it worked to me. I wasn't gripped by the storyline about the evil Shining people, and I completely failed to connect with them as characters to the extent I couldn't even really remember who they were. So it felt like a book that King wrote because he felt like he should write a sequel to The Shining, probably because his publisher kept on saying to him, you should write a sequel to The Shining, Stephen. So it felt like that kind of book, rather than a book that he felt a burning desire inside him to write. Whereas The Shining, I think, was a book that always felt to me like there was a lot of stuff he needed to get out of his system in that book, and I think that's why it's such an effective and powerful book. I think he's got all of that stuff out of his system long ago, and so it feels like in this book he's just kind of going over old ground again for limited purpose. So it was entertaining at times, it was powerful at times, but overall I didn't think it was a great book by any means. So the 2014 winner, then, as already stated, was Prince Lestat by Anne Rice, which I didn't read because I didn't want to read the preceding ones. So instead, I read the runner-up, The Girl with All the Gifts by M.R. Carey, which was a book I was very much aware of. So this was a book that was kind of a breakout success in the year that it came out. It was one of those books there was a lot of buzz about, lots of people were reading it, and I can understand why it was popular, even though I didn't particularly like it myself. I thought it was okay, but I didn't think it was great. So it's a book about a zombie apocalypse where one of the main characters, the girl with all the gifts of the title, is a zombie herself. But she's like a tame zombie, the book centres around a kind of research base with a school where scientists are, studying the zombie children and trying to figure out, if there's anything they can do to avert the apocalypse. So it's an interesting concept. It's a really interesting concept, and the book, has a very fast-paced plot. There's a lot of action in it. It has a bit of a YA vibe to it, in that the protagonist is a teenage girl, and it's quite light and fast-paced. There are some kind of deeper, darker themes at work in this book, but it didn't feel to me like they were explored as much as they could have been. And overall, it felt like more of a kind of comic book type treatment of the story rather than anything more serious. And indeed, Mike Carey, who wrote the book, does write comic books as well. So he's good at that kind of page turning excitement style of book. But it felt like there were some missed opportunities with this one to me, and it was also somewhat longer than it needed to be. So it's getting on for 500 pages long, and I think it probably could have been 300. So an entertaining enough read, but not fantastic. Okay, the 2015 winner then was St. Todd by Dean Koontz, and as previously stated, I ended up reading all 7 books in the Odd Thomas series, which this is the last one of, in order to give my opinion of it. And it wasn't an experience I particularly enjoyed. So Dean Koontz is an interesting writer, and he's been around for ages. He's been writing since the 70s. I always suspected with Dean Koontz, and this might be a mean thing to say, I always suspected that Dean Koontz owed a certain amount of his success to the fact that his name starts with a K. And therefore, when people went into bookshops to look for the new Stephen King book and found that Stephen King didn't have a new book out, or the bookshop had sold out of it, Dean Koontz's books would be next to it on the shelves. And they went, oh, I'll try this guy instead. He's another horror writer. That may be slightly mean-spirited of me, but I always figured that maybe Dean Koontz did owe a little bit of his success to the coincidence of the similarity of his name to Stephen King's, or the proximity of their names in the bookshop anyway. So he's written loads and loads of horror books, and some of them are pretty good. I've had a good time with a number of Dean Koontz books over the years, and I've read dozens of them probably. The Odd Thomas series, for me, highlights all the things I least like about Dean Koontz as a writer. And those are 2 things really. So one is that he can be very flowery and over the top with his writing, with his prose. And the other thing is he loves telling you his opinion on things. And his opinion on things is often, for me at least, quite annoying. So the Odd Thomas books are about this central character called Odd Thomas, who's a young man who lives in California, who works in a diner, and he can also see dead people. So he can't hear them or talk to them or anything like that, but he can see them. He can see ghosts and things like that around him. And as the book progresses, weirder and weirder stuff happens, and that continues through the series. So they have a fast-paced, kind of pulpy appeal to them. They're action-packed. I think almost all of the books in the series I quite enjoyed the first kind of quarter of, because Odd finds himself in another weird situation, and things kind of escalate, and it's all quite exciting. But by the end of each of them, the plot just seems to kind of unravel, and in the final third of all of them, I pretty much lost interest in what was going on. And as I say, Dean Koontz tends to use really flowery, over-the-top kind of purple prose to describe stuff. And Odd Thomas, who's the narrator as well as the protagonist, gives you his opinion on everything, and is quite snidey about things at times, which I just found really annoying. I found him deeply irritating as a character, and that really spoiled my enjoyment of the books. I think if you'd just taken the plots and an editor had stripped out all the flowery prose and all the bits where Odd Thomas tells you why a certain way of living your life is the best way to live your life, then I might have quite enjoyed the books. But as it was, I didn't enjoy them much at all. Okay, the 2016 book was the first one that I'd already read, and indeed it was one I did quite enjoy when I read it. So that's The Fireman by Joe Hill. So this is a kind of post-apocalyptic book about a dystopian future where this kind of fungus has infected people and causes them to spontaneously combust. So there's this kind of nightmarish new future, and it's about a family trying to navigate their way through it with the help of this mysterious character called the Fireman, who shows up kind of dressed in firefighting gear and helps them out. So it's a fast-paced adventure. It's got some interesting ideas in it. Like his father, Stephen King, Joe Hill is not afraid to throw a bit of politics into his books, but I don't mind that too much from Joe Hill. I never feel like he's being too preachy about things. And also, and this may be an important part of it, I think I'm kind of broadly aligned with him politically, whereas someone like Dean Koontz, I don't think I am broadly aligned with politically, and I think that makes a difference, doesn't it? Let's be honest. So yeah, there's a bit of kind of introspection and political thinking in there. But really, it's an enjoyable sci-fi horror adventure, and I had a lot of fun with it, and I really like the ending of that one as well. Okay, moving on to 2017 then, and another book from the King dynasty, and indeed another one I'd read before. So this is Sleeping Beauties by Stephen King and his son Owen King. And yeah, this is a book I didn't really like very much. So like The Fireman, it's kind of a post-apocalyptic dystopian kind of thing, or at least a book where there's a weird event that happens and the characters have to react to it. So in Sleeping Beauties, for some reason, women get covered in this kind of cocoon-like thing and all fall asleep. So when they fall asleep, this cocoon comes over them and they can't wake up. And if you try and remove the cocoon, they do wake up and they're like filled with homicidal fury and try and kill you. And that basically is the premise of the book. And it's one of those books, like a lot of Stephen King books, it's much too long. There's probably a decent book in here that's like half the length. But this just goes on and on and on. And it uses that kind of what I consider to be like the disaster movie way of telling a story, where you've got loads of different characters and you just see all the different characters' reaction to what's going on. So there isn't, or wasn't for me at least, a kind of central character to really connect with to pull me through the story, which I think always helps, particularly in a big book. You need, or I find I need, someone to kind of latch onto, and I didn't get that in Sleeping Beauties. So yeah, there's kind of some interesting ideas in it, but also kind of some ideas about gender politics that are probably a bit dodgy, and yeah, it's definitely too long. Okay, 2018 then, another book by Stephen King, and a much shorter one. So that's good, I guess. So that book is Elevation, which is a novella, which is I don't know, like Dr. Sleep. This is a book that takes two different concepts, two different stories, and mashes them together. And the two different stories in this are, there's a story about a guy who suddenly discovers that he's losing weight. And when I say losing weight, I don't mean he's losing weight in a good way. I mean he's losing weight inexplicably, but doesn't physically look any different. So he's literally losing mass, basically. He no longer weighs as much. Whenever he gets on the scales, he weighs less. And he can't, it's completely inexplicable. And he goes to the doctor, and the doctor can't figure out what's going on. So it's quite an interesting, intriguing concept, with a kind of a bit of a Twilight Zone vibe to it. I do quite like stories like that just take a weird idea and run with them. So there's that story. And then the other story is a story about the relationship between that same guy and his neighbours, who are a lesbian couple who have opened a restaurant in the town that they live in, which nobody wants to go to because they're lesbians. So the town people are kind of boycotting it. And he has this kind of fractious, the hero has this kind of fractious relationship with them, but is trying to do the right thing by them. And yeah, so these two stories, which have really nothing to do with each other, other than the fact that the same character is involved in both, are blended together, not particularly successfully, into a book that just ends up feeling really quite weird. The ending is very strange, and it kind of makes sense in terms of the progression of the story and things like that, but is nevertheless very strange. I was not transported, as King took me through the story, he didn't manage to suspend my disbelief enough for me to do anything other than shake my head at the ending. And then you've also got this concept of this guy basically trying to help these women out, but doing it in quite a patronising way, and feeling like they owe him something for it, really. So there are some moments in this book that work really well. There's one scene in particular, and I won't say what it is because it'll spoil it, but that was genuinely suspenseful, and I really wanted to know the outcome. But aside from that, I didn't enjoy this at all. The best thing I can say about it is it's very short. Okay, more Stephen King. So 2019 then, and we have The Institute. I didn't like this one either. So this is another one where you've got the two stories mashed together. So this book has The Institute, which is a school for gifted children who've got like psychic abilities of some description. And it feels a lot like King's book, The Firestarter, in some respects, in that there's kind of secret government agencies taking these kids and doing experiments on them and all that stuff. So you've got that, which I and that part of the story I didn't particularly enjoy. It felt like I say, a retread of Firestarter. I thought Firestarter did it better, and I don't think Firestarter is one of King's best books, but I thought it did it better than this. This felt like a pointless retread of themes he'd gone over before. But then you've got another part to the story which I actually did quite enjoy, which is about a guy who's a cop, or an ex-cop, who's lost his job and is just kind of bumming around America trying to figure out what to do with his life, basically, and ends up working in this small town for the police department, as what's called a night knocker, I think. So he kind of goes around keeping an eye on things at night. So that story I really enjoyed. That character I quite enjoyed, but he's hardly in it at all. The first 50 or so pages of the book is all about him, and then it moves on to being about the Institute, and then it's only at the end that he comes back in again. And I was quite enjoying his part of the story, and so to have it ripped away from me and get chucked into another story, which I didn't enjoy very much, was not particularly satisfying for me, I have to say. So yeah, another one that I didn't particularly love. Okay, on to 2020 then, and another book I had read before, and this time one I did really, really enjoy. So I think this is definitely my favourite book on the list, actually, and that is Mexican Gothic by Silvia Moreno-Garcia, which is as the title suggests, a Gothic novel set in Mexico. So about a young woman who gets a letter from her cousin, I think it is, who's just got married, and who asks her to go back to Mexico, to the countryside, to stay with her and her husband. And as the book progresses, things get weirder and weirder. And it's definitely a slow burn. So the first half of the book is all about building up that atmosphere. But then as you start figuring out what's actually going on, it's tremendously effective. And like The Girl with All the Gifts, I think this was a bit of a breakout book in that it was a horror book that people who aren't horror fans read and enjoyed. And indeed I read it for a book club I was part of that's like not a horror book club at all. I think it's possibly the only horror book we've read, actually, but it was one that everyone was keen to read and everyone enjoyed. And I think going back to this, this idea of the Goodreads Awards being a bit of a popularity contest, you can kind of see that in that if Stephen King's got a book out, he stands a reasonable chance of winning, and if not, it's probably going to be a breakout book that everyone's been talking about. But yeah, Mexican Gothic is definitely a book I recommend. I think it was a lot of fun. 2021 then, another one I'd read before and one I did not like, albeit it's from an author who I normally really like, and that's The Final Girl Support Group by Grady Hendrix. So this is a book that kind of explores the slasher genre, and it's about as the title suggests, a bunch of final girls. So there are a bunch of women who've all been involved in kind of slasher type scenarios, and as you learn more about those, you see that they all kind of relate to a popular film franchise. So there's one that's kind of equivalent of the Nightmare on Elm Street films. There's one that's like the Friday the 13th films. There's one that's like the Scream films and so on. And they kind of band together because they discover there's a new threat, basically, and it's about them trying to overcome that. My problem with the book was it just felt a bit too knowing. And that is something Grady Hendrix often does very well in his books, is weave in his knowledge of the horror genre and kind of some commentary on the horror genre. And that can make for an interesting read. And books of his like My Best Friend's Exorcism and We Sold Our Souls, which do that, I really enjoyed. But this one just didn't work for me. What I found out subsequently was that it was a book he'd written quite a while ago, and had tried to get published, and nobody was interested in it at the time. But given that he's quite popular at the moment, his publishers were looking for a book of his that they could publish while they were waiting for him to finish his new book, How to Sell a Haunted House. And Final Girl Support Group ended up getting dusted off and published. So yeah, as I say, I did not think it was a great book. I thought Stephen Graham Jones's book, My Heart is a Chainsaw, which is similar in its kind of exploration of the slasher genre, was far superior. So on to 2022 then, and a book I hadn't read and hadn't even heard of. So this is Hidden Pictures by Jason Rekulak. So this was interesting and partially successful. So when I mentioned it in a video, a lot of commenters said they'd read it. Some of them seemed to love it, some of them seemed to hate it, and I definitely fell more towards the latter camp. So it's a book about a young woman who is hired by a couple to look after their son as like a nanny, and the son is someone who has an imaginary friend, as kids often do, but his imaginary friend may or may not be a ghost. So he draws like cute pictures and things like that, which crop up throughout the book. But every so often you get a somewhat more disturbing one where you can see the kind of imaginary friend character in some kind of disturbing situation, and it's about the young woman trying to figure out what's going on, trying to work out if there really is a ghost and things like that. It's written very much like a modern thriller. So you've got this young female protagonist, you've got lots of twists, lots of short chapters, that kind of thing, as she works through the mystery, and it worked for me. It kept me reading right up until the end, which just was a bit bonkers and I didn't like at all. There was something about the positioning of the ending, and I can't talk too much about it because I don't want to give away the twist, but there was something about the twist, a particular element of the twist, which I just felt was quite unpleasant and unnecessary. One of my commenters, when I was about to read the book, left a comment which for me sums it up very well. So the commenter was Beezus99, so thank you Beezus99. The comment was, so right now I'm reading Hidden Pictures, which was a bestseller here in the States and a very popular title in the library where I work. Unfortunately to me, it reads as if R.L. Stine was a QAnon adherent and wrote a Goosebumps for adults. That is the most perfect review of this book that anyone could write. So yeah, I wasn't a big fan in the end. So 10 books talked about then, and I think hypothesis proven in that it really does feel like the Goodreads Awards is a popularity contest, and that the books that will win will either be books that are kind of breakout books, like Hidden Pictures, which suddenly gain popularity and loads of people read, or books by Stephen King, basically. So yeah, if you're not Stephen King, you need a breakout book that gets real word of mouth. So as I said at the start, I thought it would be interesting to compare the Goodreads winners to the Stoker Awards winners for the same years for Best Horror Novel. So if we look through them, so 2013, the Stoker Award winner was Dr. Sleep, same as the Goodreads Awards. But after that, the books are all different, and I think it's a stronger list of books. So as I said, I wasn't particularly a fan of Dr. Sleep. I'm not sure what else came out in 2013, but I suspect they could have found something better. But anyway, moving on then. So 2014, so the Goodreads Award winner was Prince of Stat by Anne Rice. The Stoker Award winner was Bloodkin by Steve Rasnick-Tem, which I've not heard of, so I will have to check that out and see what it's like. 2015, St. Odd, The Last Odd Thomas book by Dean Koontz, won the Goodreads Award. Definitely didn't like that. The Stoker went to A Head Full of Ghosts by Paul Tremblay, which I recently read and reviewed on the channel and I thought was fantastic. So definitely a thumbs up from me. 2016, so The Fireman won the Goodreads Award. I thought The Fireman was good, but the book that won the Stokers was The Fisherman by John Langham, which I thought was excellent. So again, I've reviewed that on the channel. I thought that was a very, very good book, very creepy. 2017, Sleeping Beauties won the Goodreads Award. I did not like Sleeping Beauties. Ararat by Christopher Golden, which I haven't read. I've heard some good things about Christopher Golden, but I've not read that one. So that won the Stokers. 2018, so Elevation by King, which I didn't like, won the Goodreads Choice Award. Cabin at the End of the World, again by Paul Tremblay, won the Stoker. So I haven't read that yet. I'm about to read it. I'm going to be reading it this week. So looking forward to reading that one. As I say, Head Full of Ghosts by Tremblay I thought was excellent. 2019 then, so The Institute by King won the Goodreads Choice Award. Wasn't really a fan, as I've said. Coyote Rage by Al Goingback won the Stoker. So I haven't read that one. I have read another book by her, which I really quite enjoyed. Coyote Rage is one I do want to read, so I will get to that at some point. But it certainly feels like a more interesting choice of winner than The Institute. 2020, we had Mexican Gothic, as I've said, won the Goodreads Choice Awards. The Only Good Indians by Stephen Graham Jones won the Run the Stoker. So I really liked Mexican Gothic, but I liked The Only Good Indians even more. I thought The Only Good Indians was an excellent horror novel. 2021, Final Girl Support Group won the Goodreads Choice Awards. The Stoker went to My Heart Was a Chainsaw by Stephen Graham Jones, which, if you remember a few minutes ago, I thought did the same thing as the Final Girl Support Group, but a lot better. So that definitely gets a thumb up from me. 2022, the Stoker winner has not yet been announced, but I'm fairly confident it will be better than Hidden Pictures. So yeah, I hope you found that interesting. I certainly found it an interesting experiment to be part of, even if reading the actual books was a bit painful at times. Sorry this video has gone on so long. I knew it was going to be a long one. It's currently at 50 minutes. It may well come down a fair bit from that in the edit, but it's definitely going to be one of my longer videos. I definitely need a cup of tea now. But as I said at the start, I will put a link to the playlist with all of the other people who've been involved in this project, all the videos they've made about the genres they explored. I think for me, it definitely feels like the Goodreads Choice Awards for horror, at least, is not a great gauge of quality, and I would definitely err towards using the Stokers when trying to pick a book to read rather than the Goodreads Choice Awards. But yeah, let me know what you think. Let me know if you agree with that. Let me know if you've read any of the books I talked about and what you thought of them. And as always, thank you very much for watching. Hope you're safe and well out there. Hope you're reading good stuff, and I'll speak to you again very soon. Cheerio.